Speaking of everything we're speaking about, and this one, I know you have experience in this arena because of your book and your life, but I have to ask this question: would you rather have something similar happen to you with the story of Job, or have something similar happen to you with the story of Jesus, to where you're taking either you're going through the Job experience or the Jesus one, and both will be for different purposes, obviously, but which one would you rather take?
Well, yeah, good question. I would have to pick.
Hello everyone, welcome to 1000 Crazy Questions, the podcast. I'm your currently sane host, Houston Pierce. This is a podcast where we have on at least one guest a week and ask them a series of crazy would you rather questions. We get into the psyche of our guests, explore topics and questions that maybe should not have been explored.
Okay, let's get into the episode this week. This week we have with us author of A Different World, theologist, apologist, and most importantly, man of faith, David Libby. David, if you introduce yourself to the listeners and tell them a bit more about you.
Well, thank you, Houston. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm a self-employed logger who lives in central Maine, way up in the northeastern United States, and also, like you said, somebody who's deeply interested and has studied for many years in areas of theology, philosophy, and have served in the church for many years as first a deacon and then an elder, and now I'm involved in kind of a mission work, Christian ministry up here in central Maine, and kind of a spiritually stony, spiritually dead part of the world, and very glad to be here, being used by the Lord. And I guess related to my book, A Different World, I'm the husband of a wife who's been chronically ill for many years, and the father of two daughters who've been very seriously chronically ill for many years, and doing better now, but we went through a very difficult decade and a half thereabouts, and that's the topic of the book, A Different World, subtitled God's Sovereignty in the Face of Suffering. Briefly tells my family's story, but our very, very difficult and enduring battle with chronic illness, and then seeks to answer some of the challenging philosophical and theological questions that are prompted by a life of suffering.
Yeah. No, thank you for writing. That's a hard subject to kind of share with the world too. Would you say that the sickness that you and your family had kind of jump-started you being an apologist, or was there some other catalyst that got you into that?
Yeah, actually, what jump-started my interest in Christian apologetics really predates this illness by some years. My wife, when I first met her, was not a Christian, did not follow the Lord. She was actually coming out of some pretty significant New Age, dark occultic kind of stuff. And she had a lot of really difficult, challenging questions for me. I claim to believe that a biblical worldview was objectively true, and she had tough questions, and I had no good answers to those tough questions. So that kind of put me on a path of self-education. It wasn't just so I could answer her. I wanted these answers myself. If I believe in a worldview that isn't true, I want to know it. I don't want to believe things that aren't true. So it was really my wife before we were married. We weren't even really romantically involved yet. We were just really good friends, and she had hard questions. I did not have answers, and that headed me down a road of discovery, wanting to find out, are there good answers to these hard questions? And I assure you that there are.
Yeah, no, that's commendable, honestly. Yeah, I know, me, a little background here. Me being Christian myself, I kind of, I was raised in church, and that's kind of just been my normal life. And then, as a teenager, I was a freshman in high school, some things happened at home to where things got rough, and I kind of had to choose whether or not if I wanted to continue to be Christian, and I kind of re-chose it as an adult, got re-baptized, and it was kind of a decision, but I've always been the one to kind of question these things, and luckily my family was able to give me some answers, but even when you have answers, you don't have all the answers. And when someone questions me on my faith, not that people are coming up to me in the street, but if I am questioned, I usually have to come back down to my personal experiences, and I've gotten into debates with close friends. One of them actually, one of my closer friends, he's what's the word? When you're on the fence, but you're not sure. It's like agnostic.
Agnostic,
He's
probably, yeah.
Yeah, he's an agnostic atheist. I say that because he's very much on the border of being an atheist. I think he says he's agnostic. I'm using quotations, but he's more of an atheist. But anyway, we get into debates all the time, and it's always started by him about religion.
Mm-hmm.
And when we do that, I usually have to just kind of, the bedrock of my foundation comes back to my experiences. I can't use logic. Logic kind of breaks down. I have to go, hey, this happened in my life. I know this to be true, right? But that's not something I can share with someone on a logical thing. To me, apologetics is very interesting because I've tried, not unintentionally, apologizing, I guess, in a way to explain faith to my friend. But it breaks down, and I kind of just like, well, it breaks down. To me, it's kind of like that's part of it. But so apologetics to me is interesting. I mean, would you say, not to go down too far into the rabbit hole here, but would you say that you use more so logic or philosophy or personal experience to explain the Bible?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, Houston. And before I answer that, don't let me get away with not answering it. I tend to get sidetracked. But before I answer it, I would say that God's word tells us very clearly that the body of Christ, the body of believers, is kind of an eclectic blend. And, we've got the text in Paul's letters to the Corinthians where he talks about how each member of the body is you get the eye and the ear and the foot and the hand, and he's drawing an analogy, and no one part has any right to say to the other parts, I have no need of you. So we're all different, and we all have a place in the body of Christ. So what's the best way to give a defense of the Christian faith? Well, it would depend upon the person you're talking to, right? I mean, some people are very logical minded, and a logical defense would resonate more with those people. Whereas other people, sometimes the best way to defend the Christian faith is just to give testimonies. Who is Jesus Christ and what has he done for me? So anyway, so back to your question, I think that no matter how our brains are wired, no matter how we think, no matter how we relate to the world around us, and we all do in very different ways. Some people are artists, some people are mathematicians, but no matter how we relate to the world, there are defenses that are rock solid and can be tailored to each individual. And so you ask how I would defend the faith. I tend to gravitate toward the philosophical arguments, and I'm actually publishing a second book. It's going to be available imminently, titled Apologize Without Apologizing. Apologize means give a defense without saying you're sorry for it, give a bold defense. And it focuses on philosophical arguments. So when you say that you're not so logical minded, and many people aren't, the fact is you're using logic right now, even as we have this conversation. And so a philosophical defense would focus on how do you make the claim that you can have any such thing as objective knowledge. Right now we're delving into the realm of philosophy called epistemology, dealing with knowledge. How do you justify your beliefs? But how can you have any such thing as objective knowledge without norms or rules that govern right and wrong thinking, that define the parameters of rationality? And how can there be an objective rationality without a transcendent lawgiver, without a God? If rationality is simply a matter of personal opinion, just like ethics, if you can define rationality your way, I can define it my way, then we end up in a place where there is no objective truth. And that's what our culture has accepted, right? Our culture has accepted this relativism. The great atheists like Friedrich Nietzsche recognized that fact. Without a transcendent lawgiver, there is no absolute in the realm of rationality. Or think of it this way: if someone's making a really wacky argument that is totally irrational, you might say this person's thinking has gone off the rails. But that's only possible if there actually are rails to go off from, right? So, so if we accept the fact that there are right and wrong ways to think, if there is such a thing as irrationality, think of like embracing both sides of a contradiction, that sort of thing, then there must be a transcendent God who can impose these rules upon us, these laws upon us. Otherwise, they're reduced to a matter of opinion. We're caught in a trap of subjectivity that necessarily reduces to, big fancy word, reduces to nihilism. That is a philosophy that says that there are no absolutes. Well, if there are no absolutes, then you cannot argue for nihilism because your argument depends upon absolutes. So it's self-defeating. To argue for nihilism is to refute it. You're depending upon absolutes as you argue for it. So That's kind of the gist of the philosophical arguments that I would make in the book that I'm publishing, that I believe show the existence of a transcendent God without question. There has to be a God, or this is a nihilistic world. Well, this cannot be a nihilistic world because nihilism refutes itself, essentially. I get in a lot more detail, but there's kind of the thumbnail sketch.
Yeah, whoa. No, well, thank you for breaking that down because I was able to follow it, and those are kind of heady topics to go into. So I appreciate you that kind of breaking that down. I have maybe like 5 more follow-up what questions, but that's interesting. The philosophical argument's definitely the one that I get the most. I think, yeah, and honestly, it's kind of makes me ready to throw these some questions at you because I think philosophy is a good bedrock to answer these. Audience, real quick, here are the rules of the game.
There are 2 rules to this game/conversation. Rule number 1, you must always answer the question no matter what. If you honestly have no preference towards one or the other, you say the phrase, flip a coin, and we move on. Rule number 2, whoever asks the question doesn't have to answer it if they choose not to. These rules exist because as questions become harder to answer, these rules become harder to follow.
This week, we have a Blue Man episode, so the topics discussed and questions asked will be family friendly. They don't know how out there they're going to get. They may not be, I don't know. It may go different places, but it's PG, at least right now. David, just want to remind you, if you have any questions for me, variations of questions I have asked, you're never interrupting. It's a conversational podcast. We go back and forth. Quick but important disclaimer to the listeners, everything is hypothetical. I say it every week, but every week it's true. If you're offended by this episode, sorry, you've chosen a pretty deep, and if you can't tell already, religious one. So enjoy this philosophical back and forth. And lastly, before we begin, David, is there any inherent mental biases you may have?
No, I don't think so.
You can take that question anywhere you want. Like no hatred towards cats, no aversion to the color orange. I don't know, anything strange.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be asked anything by anyone, and the worst that might happen is I might say I don't know.
Good outlook. All right. First question: would you rather have to eat everything hot or have to eat everything cold?
Everything hotter. It's a good question. I would say probably everything cold, personally. I don't mind food that's ordinarily hot, cold, pizza, stew, whatever, but I really wouldn't want to eat hot ice cream.
Yeah, your mind automatically goes to the extremes of these. Yeah, I guess. So what's something that sucks the cold, though? I don't know, like, what if it's a cold day? You just, a cold cocoa? I mean, I don't know.
Good point.
I guess there's spice to save you, because like if you eat something spicy that's cold, that's kind of a cheat, because then that kind of warms you up.
Right.
I'm having trouble thinking of a dish that's just always supposed to be hot. Soup, I guess. But you said you're fine with cold soup, so whatever. Yeah,
I guess the fat would congeal. That would be kind of gross, but you can always take your spoon and pick the congealed fat out. So you actually got me thinking, Houston. You got me thinking because I can live without ice cream, but I can't live without coffee, and I don't like coffee cold at all. So I don't know. You're making a good point there.
It sucks. I think I might choose cold because I can do cold coffee, but I can't drinking hot waters all the time. No, I'll take water. I'll take cold.
Okay.
I'll
stick with cold too.
Yeah. Speaking of hot and cold, would you rather have the power to create life from nothing or know everyone's future and past but your own?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's nigh omnipotence because you don't know your own future, but everyone else here.
Right. Well, honestly, I really wouldn't want to have either of those powers. That would be that's God's purview, not mine. But I don't want to avoid the question. You said to pick one or the other. I think I would rather know everybody's future except my own, because the other alternative, to be able to create life out of nothing, I'm afraid that being a sinful human being, I would probably abuse that and do bad things with it. I'm not quite sure what, but I wouldn't want to do bad things with that power, and that certainly I would have that potential. But, I guess given more thought, my answer could change.
Yeah. Well, it begs the question for either of these. So what would you, if you could see the past and future of everyone around you, what would you do with it?
I guess.
I mean, would you be sort of a prophet for sure? I mean, you can kind of, or, a psychic or a prophet, someone's past, future. So would you maybe go out into the streets and be like, this is going to happen to you. That's going to happen to you. You might want to change this. otherwise this will happen, would you just make it known, or would you just use it for your family? Would you be sensational, go on television? What path would you take?
Well, one would, of course, want to warn people if he sees something harmful in the future, but that also prompts another question. If you know the future, then is it actually changeable? Because if I know that A is going to happen, and whatever it is bad, and so I warn Houston, I tell you, hey, don't follow this path because this bad thing will happen. If I know it's going to happen, then isn't it going to happen, no matter what I say to you?
You know what? I don't know, because in fiction, which is the only thing I can turn to, sometimes you have the future you can change, and sometimes you have the written future. And I go back and forth on this. And this is sort of I'm talking to the perfect person, but God, right? He knows the future.
Yep.
But if he says, but we also have the illusion of free will, because if he knows what we're doing, but we don't, we kind of think we're doing all these things. If we change something, okay, does God know both futures? Does he know future A and future B? Or does he know future A will happen? Because both would count as being omnipotent. Or maybe I'm thinking about that incorrectly. To use a very classic example, if Eve, for instance, didn't take the apple and mess everything up, does he kind of just know that future, kind of like a multiverse situation where he just knows how that would have gone if it had happened and what consequences would have happened from that? Or do you legit leave it in her hands, and when she chose it, was like, yeah, he knew she was going to pick it all the time? Like the path is fixed? I think the latter may be true, where it's fixed, and it just seems like we're just kind of going through it, but to him it's very much fixed. I think that's simpler to explain. But in this question, I guess it'd have to be A, where the path is fixed, and my future is going to be messed up. You try to warn me and it doesn't work, or the precautions I take to avoid what's going to get me in trouble. So I guess it's fixed. So you would just see me make the mistake that you tried warning me to not make, and it's almost not even worth the breath telling me to not do something, in which case the power becomes useless. I don't know. I just talked in a giant circle, but yeah, knowing the future sucks, I think. I mean, at least if you can't change it.
Right.
And
right.
On that level, if the rules of the universe are the path is fixed, then I think this question is fixed.
Right. Yeah. So right. So you're getting into some fairly deep theology and fairly deep philosophy here, and I would argue that I've heard all kinds of different arguments from people on all different sides of this issue, and I think that the Bible makes it clear that God is not only all-knowing, but all-powerful, and that he knows the end from the beginning, that he has foreordained whatsoever comes to pass, Ephesians chapter 1, and he works all things together for the good of his people, Romans 8:28, and he can't be working all things together for our good if he's not working all things together. So is the future fixed? I would say that it would be a logical impossibility for it not to be. If God knows the future, it has to be certain that it will come to pass. And people try to get around that by, you talked about contingencies earlier. I forget how you put it, but does he just know every contingency? Well, if he's all-knowing, then he would know every contingency for sure, no question. But he would also know which one you're going to pick and which one everyone's going to pick. Otherwise, he's not all-knowing. So how does that fit in with free will? The Bible teaches clearly that we also have free will. But I would say the fact that, that our conversation here was ordained from before the foundation of the world doesn't mean that we're not also freely choosing to do it. Both are true. There's nothing in God's foreordaining decree that demands logically that our wills be forced. We're still acting freely. What are the chances that we would have acted freely in some way other than what God had ordained? Well, zero chance, but it doesn't mean that the actions aren't still, free. Mind-blowing, we can't wrap our brains around it, but it's not irrational. It hasn't crossed the line into irrationality. I wrote quite a lot about that in the book, A Different World, actually. I addressed that subject in a little more depth, if anyone's interested.
Yeah, no, it is very, very mind-blowing. We're talking about it, I'm having trouble keeping up.
Yeah.
But I think logically, too, I think free will doesn't exist just from like a logical kind of scientific point of view, because, and I got this from, what's his name? There's a channel on YouTube, and no, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's this guy named Matt Matthew or something. He's like a dollar store Chris Hemsworth. He makes a bunch of science videos, and he explained how free will scientifically doesn't really exist, which is something I think, based philosophically does and doesn't exist, like we're talking about. But scientifically speaking, on the cereal you had for breakfast this morning, you chose to have Captain Crunch over Raisin Bran. I'm making this up, and you chose to have that. But when did you choose to be in the kitchen? Okay, when you woke up and decided to go to the kitchen. When did you choose to wake up? You didn't really. Your heart was beating, and your mind told your signal, whatever, told your brain to get up. When did you choose to have this brain? You didn't. It was decided based on this DNA from your mom and your parents. When did you decide to be born? When did you decide for your parents to? But it kind of just goes down a chain link, or like a rabbit hole sort of decisions that are out of your control ultimately. And it kind of makes it determinism, I think is the word of it, where everything that you do is determined by chemicals and played out paths that were just going to happen outside of your control. So scientifically speaking, there is also no free will. And not that it doesn't seem like we have it, because we all know we think we have free will. It's very relatable. We think we made choices, and I think to an extent we very much do. But if you look at it philosophically and logically, I think it breaks down. Yeah.
Well, I think some defining of terms would be necessary at this point. So freedom is not an absolute term, right? There are degrees of freedom. And for example, this is an illustration actually used in my book, A Different World. My girls, when they were growing up, we're a very rural, homesteading kind of family. We do a lot of hunting, fishing, foraging for wild edible plants, gardening, and so forth. And so when my girls were very young, they learned how to shoot. They were shooting .22 rifle when they were 5, 6 years old, and they were very responsible. They knew how to handle guns, and they were very safe, responsible with them. They knew how dangerous they are. They are very dangerous. So by the time they were, 11, 12 years old, they had the freedom to use any of my guns anytime. They didn't have to. If I was off at work and they were homeschooling and a coyote came trotting through the backfield, they could grab a gun and shoot it if they wanted to. They didn't have to ask first. That's real meaningful freedom. But they did not have the freedom to shoot down the moon, right? Because that's out of the capabilities of both them and my firearms. They did not have the freedom to shoot at each other or any of my logging equipment or at the wife's car, because that they're not allowed to do. They'd be in big trouble. So there were rules against that. The only point I'm trying to make so far, only one point, we could try to tease this out too far. The one point I'm making so far is that freedom is not an absolute term. People think that if you're not the master of your own destiny, you don't have freedom at all. That's not true. You can have freedom, but it's freedom within certain limitations, certain parameters. When people talk about free will, what they often mean is unlimited freedom. Big fancy word, autonomy, self-rule. They say, if I have free will, then I must be the master of my own destiny, and that's not true. You can have freedom that's very limited within certain parameters. So freedom of will and God's sovereignty are not at odds with each other. We can, like I said earlier, illustration I used a minute ago, the fact that we're, freely choosing to have this conversation doesn't mean that it wasn't ordained by God from before the foundation of the earth. Now, about the breakfast cereal and the chemicals and in the brain and everything that that leads to that decision, the fact that there are a couple of different ways you can fit that into two different worldviews. You can fit it into an atheistic worldview. I've heard atheists deny the reality of free will for those very reasons that you gave. We're nothing but a bunch of chemicals, and all we are is matter that responds to stimuli, and so really nothing that we choose really is free. We're just chemicals. We're just doing what baking soda and vinegar do when the two come in contact with each other. So I would reject that worldview. I believe that the Bible teaches very clearly that we are made in God's image with free will, with a volition, within the parameters of God's sovereignty. But there also is something to that, because how does God ordinarily work? He ordinarily works through ordinary means. So if I'm going to freely choose to be here on your podcast, what led to that free choice? Did it involve chemicals? Did it involve external stimuli and so forth? Well, of course it did. God ordinarily works through ordinary means. So I think the atheists are kind of onto something, but they're coming to some incorrect conclusions, I would argue. The conclusion that I mean is we're nothing but matter. We're not actually making any choices. We're just reacting to stimuli. We're just like, all we are is baking soda that can't help but fizz when vinegar is poured on it. And I think there's more to us than that, honestly.
Yeah. No, I agree. That's pretty well put. Yeah, I didn't even think about degrees of freedom being a thing, but that's very much true. Yeah, and that's the conclusion. There's the difference between the scientific backing for no free will versus the philosophical and religious reason. There's no free will. But yeah, to rile it back a little bit to the question, and just because I'm curious, and I know you picked to know the future or past, but if you could create life from nothing, what would you make? Would you make anything? Would you, I don't know, an animal or anything like that?
If I could create life from nothing, I don't know. There are times when I have been deer hunting in the cold, sitting on a tree stand for days without seeing anything. I might create a big buck and have him walk by the tree stand. I'm kind of kidding, but that'd be kind of like cheating, wouldn't it?
Kind of, a little bit. It's stalking a pond.
Yeah. Right. If I'm fishing, maybe I want to have a great day of fishing, so I just create hundreds and thousands of massive trout. I don't know. Interesting question. I'm not quite sure what to do with it, honestly.
Yeah. I guess you wouldn't have to use it if you didn't want to. I don't know what I would do. It's just a fun thought experiment. But speaking of everything, do you think God makes mistakes? And I know the answer seems obvious, no, but there was this one line. I don't know if you know the rapper Lil Dicky.
No.
Okay, there's this rapper named Lil Dicky. He's kind of a funny guy. His name is it's purposely a joke. He calls himself Lil Dicky, and
didn't even get it at first, but anyway, yeah.
Rap, hip hop, it's kind of self-aggrandizing, and he's very much the opposite. When you make fun of yourself, I can't think of the word right now, but
self-deprecating.
There it is. Yeah. So he's kind of that type of person, funny guy. And there's this song where he's talking about like he's just talking to this girl he just like slept with, and it's kind of that awkward moment where you're kind of sitting there after sex and nothing's really happening, and he's like, hey, what about dinosaurs? And they start having this philosophical kind of debate about what was that about? Like, does God make mistakes? And if not, what are the dinosaurs doing here? Like, what was that for? And I want to know. This may sound silly, but what is your defense for things like that? And what about all these fossils we find to a bigger extent? These half human, half ape. We don't have the whole missing link thing yet, but like what evolution sort of, and all these chinks in the historical armor of, well, what's this about? Was this a mistake? Is this intentional? What does this say about religion? Is this wrong? Is this right? Yeah. The defense with that.
Yeah. Good question. And actually I keep putting in plugs from my books. I'm sorry for the shameless plugs, but that's kind of the big question in a different world. The naturalist and atheist philosopher Ernst Haeckel, a contemporary of Charles Darwin's, coined a brand new phrase, what he called the dysteleological argument. The teleological argument for the existence of God. Teleology is purpose, design, fancy word for purpose and design. So the teleological argument says that the world really looks like it's been designed. It doesn't appear to be chaotic and chance created. So therefore there must be a designer. They use the watch analogy. If you're walking through the woods and you find a pocket watch laying on the ground, you don't think it just came about by chance. You assume somebody made it. Well, the world, or even the little patch of woods that watch is found in, is far more complex than that watch. So therefore, it must have a designer. Well, Ernst Haeckel, he actually did not originate this argument. It had been around long before him. David Hume, philosopher, 100 years before Haeckel, made the same argument. But his response was, if that is true, then if this world was designed, it must not have been designed by the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible supposedly does not make any mistakes. But look at the world that's filled with mistakes. You've got suboptimal design, diseases, death, suffering, all kinds of stuff that a perfect and benevolent God would not have done. So he called it that the dysteleological argument in response to the teleological argument. So my response to that is that no, God does not make any mistakes. But what you think are mistakes really aren't. Read Genesis chapter 3. When man fell into sin, God cursed his creation. And as a result, we have the pain, suffering, suboptimal, what we think is suboptimal, excuse me, I'm getting my words all mixed up here, suboptimal design, but really it isn't. And I agree with that. God is a sovereign God, and he made this world as it is for his own purposes. Now, people have asked me, what reason would God what reason would God have had for creating things like mosquitoes and leeches and ticks? Well, to bite us, to make us itch, to make us sick, because we read about that in Genesis 3. Now, in Genesis 3, when God cursed his creation, he told Adam that from now on you eke out a living by the sweat of your brow, weeds and thorns will grow in amongst your crops, and it's going to be difficult for you. And he told Eve, you'll give birth with great pain in childbirth, and so forth and so on. And so imagine Adam pulling weeds out of his garden, and a young atheist philosopher comes along and says, hey, Adam, I heard you believe in a perfect God. Well, don't those thorns in your garden prove that such a God could not exist? And Adam's response ought to be, well, no, God put those thorns there. You can read about it in Genesis 3. So they do not, this world is as the Bible says it would be, complete with sufferings, trials, tribulations, and it is by God's design. We bristle at that. We don't like that, but that is what the Bible teaches. As far as the, little bit of an aside here, as far as the half man, half ape, missing link things go, I don't believe that there are any. I've looked into that in some depth, and there's a book I'd love to read. I've never read it, and I don't even recall the name of the author. I was just talking with somebody else about it recently, but the name of the book, I think it was written back in the 90s. The name of the book was, I may be getting this wrong, it was something like, I think, Bone of Contention, I think was the name of the book. It'd be cool to look it up. I've never tried to look it up. But it was written by a fellow who had been an atheist and an anthropologist, and he was studying human evolution, and he was an evolutionist, and he actually got to see the real thing, the real relics, which, when you go to the Smithsonian and you see a skull or some ancient artifact, some bone or something that was dug up, you're not seeing the real thing, you're seeing a replica. They consider the real thing to be, too precious, too priceless, as they have those in vaults. And he actually got to go to France and actually see the real things, and he saw that all of them were misrepresented by the replicas, or they were altered, they were filed, with a Dremel tool and reshaped. And so he said there was really an awful lot of fraud. Again, I haven't read the book, and he actually became a Christian because he said, what are they trying to cover up? And we know of a lot of the scams and frauds, Piltdown Man and Nebraska Man. Piltdown Man was a scam. Nebraska Man made a whole hominid out of one tooth, and they later found it was a pig tooth, a tooth from a wild pig. And so, if you really dig into this, if you look into the evidences, you dig into the fossil evidence and so forth for evolution, you find it really weighs heavily on the creation side, the Christian side, if you look at it with an open mind, and if people are able to take off their evolutionist, humanist colored glasses and look at it objectively, I think they'll find that there's really nothing there to support human evolution. Well, anyway, that was totally an aside. That was beside the point. The point was, if God doesn't make mistakes, why are there mistakes? My answer to that is there are no mistakes. This world is as he said it would be. He said it would be a world filled with troubles, trials, tribulations, and that is because of human rebellion against him. We are all sinners. We've all sinned against God.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Wait. So two things. I was following that, but questions came to mind. So, one, I haven't dug into evolution too much, but what is your, official stance on it? On evolution, period, then? Because I've always kind of seen it as, evolution is very provable, it exists, just on the scale that species turns into this species is questionable, because I haven't looked into it too much. What's your kind of thoughts on evolution as a just period? And two, what do you think the dinosaurs were about?
Okay, yeah, great question. So the word evolution is a really good word that simply means things change, right? Like a conversation can evolve. We can start out talking about Nike sneakers and end up talking about bass fishing, the way conversations have twists and turns. So evolution is a perfectly fine word to describe, evolving, things changing. As far as Darwin's theories of origins, I would say that, first of all, there's no evidence anywhere that one species can turn into another species, that a deer can evolve from something reptilian or anything of that sort. In fact, I would argue that what we know about genetics really kind of proves that can't happen. What certainly can happen is is evolution within a genome, within a pool of genetic information. So a lot of Christians, a lot of creationists actually shoot themselves in the foot by denying things like the changes that we see within a species. Darwin did his experiments about the finch beaks and so forth, and the dappled moths in England.
Yep.
The dappled moth was a moth that
I was going to say
black
that.
and white,
It's
but
very
there'd be varying amounts of black and white in areas where there was heavy coal mining and the trees were covered with coal dust. The moths were all black. Well, he says, okay, here's evolution happening. Here's a moth which could be all white, could be all black, or any combination in between. Eventually, given the climate they're living in, all black environment, they ended up being all black. Well, what you have there is birds being able to see any moths on the sides of the trees that have any white at all and eating them. And so you have a loss of genetic information. You have selective breeding, essentially. Eventually, they've killed off any of the genetic material that would produce any white at all. That is natural selection happening, but it's not a moth turning into something other than a moth. And as a matter of fact, it's a decrease in genetic information, not an increase. I believe that kind of natural selection would actually prevent Darwin's theories from happening. For example, how did the eye evolve? They talk about how, I've read articles about this, how some creature like an earthworm type creature, as it begins to come into the open and come into the surface more, and some mutation caused it to have some light sensitive cells on the end of its body somewhere, and over millions of years that evolved into an eye. The process of natural selection would see those light sensitive cells as something bad that ought to be weeded out. Or let me give another example. You've got a snake evolving legs, through some mutation, get some little useless appendage on the side, and over millions of years, more mutations, you end up with a leg. Natural selection would weed out that appendage. That appendage would inhibit its ability to perform its snakiness rather than help. A appendage that's useless that doesn't. You need either a full formed leg, a full formed eye, or you have something that's actually inhibition to the animal's survival. So natural selection would tend to weed that out. Besides that, what we know about DNA now and genetics, I think really, that opened a Pandora's box that Darwin could not have foreseen. And we realize now that what we are is encoded in the DNA, and nothing external can change that DNA. We have, I think too many good reasons to not believe in Darwin's theories, but yes, I do believe things change. Things can change. People were shorter many years ago than they are now. Why is that? It's not because we're evolving into a higher life form. It's because whatever genetics favored shortness, then I don't know what it would have been. Whatever conditions favored shortness brought those genes out, but the information was there all along in the genome. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, makes sense. I was thinking hard in the middle there. So if I can repeat back what I was kind of hearing, so
okay,
but it makes sense. But like from a snake evolving legs, right? Like your contention here in that example is in the time in between where the snake is still developing like a leg, and it's not a fully formed leg. Mm-hmm. There's not much of an advantage. It's a useless appendage, if not maybe even a hindrance.
It would be
without a fully formed leg. Like in the in-between stage is what you're arguing. Is like not so much a snake giving legs, because we all know that the lizard, it's successful, great, awesome, know. But it's like the transition from like tail or nothing to leg, like because we all know it takes a long time for these things to mutate, for something to evolve, doesn't quite add up because of the in-between stages, those in-between generations that have just useless appendages.
Yeah, right. Like, what's the advantage of a snake? A snake, it can move fluidly through tight places, but if you've got stuff sticking out the side that's not helping any, getting hung up on the sticks in the grass and so forth, then it would actually be a disadvantage. What's the advantage of a lizard? It's got fully formed legs. It can run and jump in ways that snakes can't. So it would kind of have to go from a snake to a fully formed lizard all in one step in order for it to not be something that natural selection would weed out.
I get it. That makes sense. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, man, I gotta look. I'm gonna sound very ignorant. I had to look way more into these things, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Lastly, the dinosaurs. What do you think?
Oh yeah, dinosaurs. Well, I think they're fascinating. I love dinosaurs. I think they're fascinating, and I think, boy, I'm speculating.
Like just why? Like I'm just
What's
saying,
that?
well, yeah, so where you're spending. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. No, just
not at all.
the why. Yeah, why do you think the why? Why go through that whole thing? They don't affect us. They died before we got here. God,
I'm not.
why? Like,
Yeah, I'm not convinced they did all die before we got here. I think the humans and dinosaurs coexisted, and there's good evidence for that. If your listeners want to look into somebody named Ken Ham, what's the name of his ministry? I'm trying to think of the name of his. Answers in Genesis is the name of his ministry, and he gets into this in a lot of detail. But we have ancient cave drawings of dinosaurs that that humans have made. Almost every culture
yeah,
has folklore that includes dragons and dinosaurs and things. So I think I personally reject the notion that this Earth is millions and millions of years old, and there are reasons to reject that. I know that's open to debate. It wouldn't destroy my worldview to find out that the world is millions of years old. It wouldn't be a big deal. But I don't think there was an age where the Earth was covered with dinosaurs and there were no mammals, no humans. I think they coexisted. There's descriptions in the Bible of things that sound like dinosaurs, Leviathan in the book of Job and Behemoth. And I think that by that time, if there were any, they were very rare. Most of them had died off. I'm guessing that probably the mass extinction of dinosaurs happened quite possibly during Noah's flood. I doubt he had a Tyrannosaurus Rex on the Ark, or a pair of them. So, a lot of speculation there, but I think there are way too many problems with that whole model that, you have the age, I forget the names of the ages, but you have the age with the little
you're talking
crustaceans.
about the Jurassic, and
Yeah.
Cretaceous.
Yeah. So, I think there are a lot of problems with that. Look into, I don't know, I've read about it a fair amount, studied it a fair amount, but quite a few years ago. But look into, I would say anybody who's interested, look into Ken Ham's Answers in Genesis and, just have an open mind. You don't need to just, I'm not saying believe everything he says just because he says it, but look at it with an open mind and an inquisitive mind, and, look at other perspectives. I think there are a lot of problems with the secular models.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I'm a bit thrown off by that, but I can look into it. Open-mindedness is something we should all be doing, and yeah, definitely. Like I don't know, just jotted it down. I might have to look back at that. But that's interesting one. Yeah. For me, the dinosaurs are a huge question mark because the thought of like they died, it's kind of like, well, why were they even here? I mean, it's a cool thing, if not just for pure inspiration, that we can look back generations later and go, these monsters ruled the world. I don't know if that was simply God's plan, that they were here just to be inspiration. I would think that's funny and awesome. But if they did share the planet with us at one point, that'd be even weirder. But
yeah, I think they probably did. One thing to bear in mind is that when we read the dinosaur books, what little boy isn't fascinated with dinosaurs? If you're a little boy and you're not fascinated with dinosaurs, there's something wrong with you, don't you think? But we read these books.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I have a niece. Yeah, I have a niece who loves little girls and boys, I think.
Yeah.
You see it. She says dinosaur. She knows what that is, and she knows
love dinosaurs.
Yeah, they're amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, but anything. One thing to keep in mind when you read these books and you see the pictures of the Stegosaurus and the Diplodocus and the Brontosaurus and the Tyrannosaurus and the Allosaurus and Velociraptor and so forth, and these are the ones that dominate our thoughts. These great big giant things. I've read that the average size of the dinosaur was about the size of a chicken. The monsters were very rare. There are very few fossils of those. If they discover a new Allosaurus, it makes world news. How many fossils have they even found? It's very few. So they did exist, no question about it. But it wasn't like there was a monster on every street corner. Most of them were very small.
Yeah, I don't know about the frequency. I haven't heard too many of that, but I know just in terms of how many there were, most of them were like chicken to car size. And then you have the Diplodocus and the Quetzalcoatlus and the craziness. But most of them are pretty. They're big comparatively to us. That's like a chicken, like the size of a kid. So like it's a big chicken, but it's still it's not as big as the ones we noticed. By the way, this is just a tidbit here, but this is related to nothing, but the Velociraptor in Jurassic Park is actually closer, it looks like a Deinonychus than it is a Velociraptor. Velociraptors have those feathers, and they're the more chickeny ones. And I Deinonychus. I think it's called Deinonychus. They're the ones that actually look more like velociraptors. Sorry, just nerd film dinosaur knowledge. I couldn't help it.
Awesome.
I love dinosaurs.
I'm gonna shut up because you know
I love
way
dinosaurs.
more about dinosaurs than I do.
No, I just like dinosaurs, and I like that movie. I love Jurassic Park. We are seriously running out of time, but this honestly the material is too dense, and I want to ask you this question. Speaking of everything we're speaking about, and this one, I know you have experience in this arena because of your book and your life, but I have to ask this question: would you rather have something similar happen to you with the story of Job, or have something similar happen to you with the story of Jesus, to where you're taking you're going through the Job experience or the Jesus one, and both will be for different purposes, obviously, but which one would you rather take?
Well, yeah, good question. I would have to pick Job. I don't want to compare my family struggles to what he went through, but there were similarities. We went through very, very hard times. As far as the Jesus experience, I think that I know we're dealing with hypotheticals here, but I'm not the sinless Lamb of God who's able to take away the sins of God's people. So that one seems a little too hypothetical for me, I guess. It's not theoretically possible for me to fulfill that role. So I would pick Job.
Okay, gotcha. It's because of it seems too outlandish. It's not because of the pain associated with either one of them. It's
right, yeah.
Okay.
It almost seems, I don't know. I don't want to. It almost seems like a little bit wrong or blasphemous to think that I could be Jesus.
Well, yeah.
And as far as pain
goes,
pain sucks. We all know that. But I've been through a lot of it in my life, and we've had a lot of suffering, and I can tell you that to endure suffering faithful to the Lord really ends up being a blessing. It truly does. We are drawn closer to Him. And God's Word tells us that He refines us like silver in a furnace. And that imagery is, I think, kind of a little more stark than we realize. Imagine yourself being put in a furnace, having the dross and the impurities burned off. That's a painful process. And so having gone through a lot of that myself, I can tell you that it is worth it. It is worth the price. So I think Job would agree too. At the time, he, in the midst of his sorrow, he was having trouble with it, of course, naturally. But he looked back and understood that it is, worth the price. That doesn't answer all our questions, does it? But it does. It does give us something real to hang our hats on. Why did God create a world where there is suffering in the first place? We can always push back harder. But we can know that He did create a world that is filled with suffering, and that He does use that for our good. I would pick Job.
Yeah. Well, thank you for answering that. I know that was kind of a tough one. Yeah, and not to put you in a blasphemous situation. I know I knew what I was asking a bit with that, because comparing you to Jesus and even Job for that matter is a bit. But yeah, your experience on the matter, your literal life lived experience, gives you a lot of authority on that. So yeah. Appreciate you answering. And second to last question here, sort of, but have you seen the movie crap? What's that movie? It stars Hugh Grant, and these two women go to his house, and they are Mormon, and they're trying to convert him because they do the door-to-door thing. And he lets them into his house, and it's a horror movie. It's like a thriller movie, and they don't really know what they're walking into. Have you heard this movie sound familiar?
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay, man, it's killing me, the name of this movie. It's a one-word title. I know someone listening right now is screaming the name into their car or their phone, wherever they're hearing this, and I can't hear them. What is the name of this movie? Oh, no. Okay, it'll come to me later. But anyway, it's a horror movie. He's not a predator, but it is dangerous, and these two girls don't know what they're doing, really, who they're talking to. And they start talking about religion, right? Because they're Mormon, and he's like, I'm really fascinated in Mormonism. He studied all the world's major religions, and he kind of challenges them on their faith. It's a very interesting movie, and this was made just last year. That takes a thriller and religion, and it's like a mainstream movie, and it got really good reviews and everything. I'm not going to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it. Even though I can't even remember the name of it, but there's a scene where he starts taking out board games, and he compares religion to a board game, and he says, this is like, this religion came first, and then this religion came second, this one came third. Here's the original board game, here's a knockoff, here's something like it. And I went through all of that just to say, I'm going to name a religion, and you name me a plant.
I'm sorry.
It's like a word. I will name a religion, like a world religion, and then you give me a plant. It's like word association. Whatever comes to mind or whatever you think matches the most. Yeah, this isn't a would you rather. This is like a exercise thing.
So did you say a plant?
Yes, I said a plant.
Like grass or daisy or palm tree?
Yep.
Okay.
Just whatever comes to mind. I'll name a religion, and you give me a plant of some type. Okay, you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. First religion. Judaism.
Plant. Judaism. How about an almond tree? Because I'm thinking of the menorah with I think I had almond blossoms on it. I'll say an almond tree.
Okay. Buddhism.
A plant. Buddhism. Lotus.
Hinduism.
That one ought to be a lotus. Ooh, Hinduism. Boy, I don't know. I'm trying to think. So Hinduism is pantheistic. Grass.
Okay. Scientology.
Oh boy, marijuana.
That's man. I'm drawing a blank. Christianity.
A fruit tree of some kind. I'm thinking of the tree of life in the book of Revelation. I'll say a peach tree.
Mormonism.
Poison sumac? I think Mormonism is a pretty poisonous religion, so poison sumac. Or for Christianity, if I could go back, I could say an oak tree, a giant oak too, because I believe Christianity is objectively true. Although I believe there's a lot of falsehood under the umbrella of what's called Christianity. We're kind of painting with a broad brush, but the true biblical worldview I believe is solid. So could say oak too, oak or peach tree. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Okay, it's fine. I want to split hairs here. Catholicism.
Boy, I don't want to listeners, but I don't believe that Catholicism is true Christianity. There are a great many deviations that are really unbiblical. So I don't know. I don't want to offend anybody, but
just to say a plant. It's just
I'm going to call true biblical
plant.
Christianity an oak tree. Then I might call Roman Catholicism poison oak. The poison oak tree.
Well,
I don't want to offend people.
Shade.
I love my Catholic friends.
It's okay. They're just plants. It's all hypothetical.
Okay.
This is the last one. And this is kind of a cheat because it's not really religion, but atheism.
Yeah. What kind of plant do I think of respecting atheism? A made-up plant that doesn't exist, maybe? No, I got to come up with something better than that. Boy, I'm drawing a blank.
You got this.
How about dogbane? Dogbane's a relative of milkweed, but milkweed's a delicious wild edible, and dogbane is not. So, and by the way, you said that atheism is not really a religion. You're exactly right. If what you're thinking of respecting religion is organized religions with cathedrals, buildings, churches, and so forth. So atheism is not that. What really unifies atheism is that they don't believe in God, but it is in fact a faith-based belief system, which does make it inherently religious in a different sense. Anyway, a little aside.
Yeah, I got you, and you took the turns pretty well. I mean, you put a lot of thought into the plants, which makes sense. Yeah, it's kind of hard to not associate attributes with the other one, with the plants. And by the way, I had to look it up because it was killing me. Heretic. The movie I'm thinking of is Heretic.
Okay.
I recommend it. It was pretty good. It gets you thinking, and it has a very, I'll say, dark sense, or ominously dark sense of religion, especially at the end of it. But it is still an entertaining movie. It does still provoke thought, and I still would recommend it.
Yeah, okay. I might look it up.
Man, yeah, that one. And this is my last question. Maybe it's like a two-parter, but what is one misconception about Christians that you would permanently wipe away if you magically could?
One misconception about Christians. So when we talk about Christianity, it's such a broadly generalized term. So I'm going to narrow that down a little bit if you don't mind. I'm going to define Christian as somebody who has a distinctly biblical worldview. Somebody who rests on the Bible as God's word and the Bible is the final authority that defines metaphysics, epistemology, theology, and so forth and so on for us. So a misconception that people have about true biblical Christians, true biblical Christianity, I guess maybe that we are a sanctimonious lot who thinks that we're in God's favor because of how good we are. That's a misconception that I would love to see erased. We're all sinners in need of God's grace, and that includes Christians. I mean, that's the whole point of Christianity. The Lord Jesus died to pay the penalty for our sins so that we can be made right, we can be reconciled with a just and holy God, not because of our merit, but because of what He's done for us. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have to strive to be obedient. I believe that is what God demands of us, but that obedience does not save us. And so we're not a sanctimonious lot who thinks that we are God's special people because of how good we are. That is a misconception. And there are people out there who, I think, promote that misconception, unfortunately. Have you experienced that? I know every little microcosm is different, so it may be different out in Colorado. I'm speaking about here in Maine, but have you noticed that?
I think that's true everywhere.
Okay.
I mean, in my experience, I would say that is a common misconception.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that was well said. That's a pretty big one. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. This is the true last question. I'm sorry, I've been drawing it
Okay.
out. Do you believe in?
I'm loving this, Houston, so you can go on as long as you want as far as I'm concerned.
No, I have to end it somewhere, but there's a whole lot. I really, honestly, this can continue for I say maybe 2 more hours. But if I could let this go on forever, but I have to cut it at about an hour or something. Do you think there are aliens?
Well, that's an interesting question. If by aliens you mean otherworldly beings, then absolutely. We know that there's a realm of demons and angels. Interestingly, I hear a lot of talk about aliens, UFOs, and so forth, and I believe this is another whole topic that we can't really get into because of time constraints, but I believe that there is an alien program out there that is very deceptive. But that's beside the point. The question is, are there really beings from other planets? I think it's possible. I don't believe there's anything in a biblical worldview that would rule that out. But it's also very possible that there aren't. It would seem interesting to me. It would seem consistent with what I know from Scripture and the nature of God to make us the only intelligent beings in this enormous universe, because it demonstrates His grandeur, the magnificence of the universe, how we are so infinitesimally small in comparison spatially, yet He set His love upon us. All that's a very consistent analogy with what I see in Scripture. So I think that it would be very reasonable to say, no, there aren't any other life forms out there for that reason. But if people find that there are, that's fine too. That doesn't shake my worldview in any way. There could be all kinds of other intelligent, civilizations out there. I really don't know. But because of the powerfulness of that analogy, I think I'm inclined to think that we may well be the only ones in this vast universe, for those reasons. Other than there is a whole spiritual realm that we know little about, demons and angels and so forth. The Bible's made that very clear.
Yeah, doesn't count. It's in the question, but yeah, I know what I get what you're saying.
Yeah,
it's funny. I actually think the same thing about the alien thing. Like maybe there are, maybe there aren't, and it doesn't really mess up or change anything, or at least in how I live my life. I mean, I think it'd be cool, and I actually do kind of want there to be, because it adds a whole nother layer of, well, chaos, craziness that I would enjoy. But if there weren't any, it would just be like, it only adds to how special, we are as creation.
Right.
Yeah. I actually get that viewpoint. Oh, yeah. A lot. Man, speaking of special, I think that's the perfect place to end. People, thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you learned a lot, questioned a lot, and I'm glad you guys are here. And David, I want to hand over the spotlight to you. Is there anything you want to ask or plug to the listeners in general?
Well, I guess not really. I've already put in plenty of plugs for my books. If you are interested in a different world or apologize without apologizing, look them up on Amazon. People say they're very easy to find. My name is David Libby, and if you search my name and the names of the books. Now, Apologize with Apologizing is not available yet, but it should be very soon. But anyway, so the books are not hard to find, I'm told, by people who actually are tech savvy, unlike me. And then last word to listeners, keep asking crazy questions and give a biblical worldview a real fair shake. I believe it's an eminently defensible position. I'm fully convinced it's objectively true. The eternal consequences are enormous. If you die unreconciled to a just and holy God, you're in big trouble. But if you're reconciled with Him, you're not in big trouble. You're in the best possible place imaginable. So, the ramifications are big. Take it seriously. I'm not telling you believe what I say because I say it. Certainly not. Ask the questions. By the way, Houston, I love this podcast. This is great. I've been on a lot of podcasts. I've never one quite like this. 1,000 Crazy Questions is the perfect name for it, and this is awesome. I love what you're doing. So, to your listeners, ask the crazy questions and really dig and seek for answers.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. And then what you said reminded me of someone's wager. I can't remember whose. It's like a philosophical thing. If someone has a wager, like
Pascal's
wager. If I'm wrong, whose wager?
Pascal.
Pascal's wager. Yeah, that's what it reminded me of.
Yeah.
It's a scary, good, thought-provoking one. But yeah, thank you for being on. I appreciate you sharing your knowledge and everything. I have some stuff to look up and look more into. It's a very deep topic that's kind of uncomfortable for people to jump into, but this show's built for that. And yeah, I think it worked. Listeners, thank you for listening. And please rate and follow 1,000 Crazy Questions wherever you find it. Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Rating helps a lot. Share this with your friends. Share this with your enemies. Everyone stay safe. Bye.